Hi, I'm Dr. Melissa Marselle from the University of Surrey, the Environmental Psychology Research Group. And today I'm going to be talking about applying the behavior change wheel to biodiversity policy. The climate and biodiversity crises are interlinked. And the recent IPCC and IPBES report stated specifically that we need to tackle both the climate and biodiversity crises simultaneously or not at all. Now, this seems like a big deal, right? They're two massive global crises. How can we handle both of them and tackle both of them at the same time? Well, the good news is that according to the report, human activity is the main cause, directly or indirectly, of both climate change and biodiversity loss. So that's good, because that means that the solution to both climate change and biodiversity loss is changing human behavior. And biodiversity loss is accelerating, and it's going to have enormous impacts on human health and well-being, as well as the impacts of the climate crisis. But most research into biodiversity conservation just focuses on the biophysical interventions. Here is an example from conservation evidence on the interventions with the most evidence of being effective for biodiversity conservation, such as plant nectar flower mixtures or cease fishing in marine protected areas. But these actions all require a person to do them. And it's less researched in the area of biodiversity conservation. The behavior change interventions that influence the behavior of a person, group, or population to do these actions. You know, the behavior change interventions to get a person to plant nectar flower strips, or the behavior change interventions to help stop somebody from fishing in a marine protected area. And this is because behavioral sciences is rarely used in nature conservation. A study by Selinsky et al. In 2018 found that only 0.3% of all papers published in the leading nature conservation journals are related or mention psychology or behavioral change at all. And as a consequence of this, behavior change interventions for nature conservation often lack grounding in any behavioral science theory, which then undermines the effectiveness of any intervention for nature conservation. And in fact, this is such a problem that there was a consortium of researchers who got together to address this problem, this interdisciplinary group of researchers. And what they did was that they wanted to pose the need for behavioral science to work with nature conservation, and they did that in two leading journals for each discipline. So in Nature Human Behavior, they did a perspective piece, focusing on the audience of psychologists and behavioral scientists, saying biodiversity conservation is a promising frontier for behavioral science, and it's something that you should get involved in. And likewise, for in publishing in Biological Conservation, the Journal of, the same group of authors, communicating to ecologists and other people working in nature conservation, saying you should make more effective use of human behavioral science in your interventions. So there are a number of different behavior change theories that can be used to inform any behavior change intervention. And there's now a recognition that any one behavior change theory is insufficient to explain the complexity of human behavior. And so we're now moving toward these new integrative models of behavior change that help intervention designers and policymakers handle the complex links between the drivers of behavior and the interventions and policies needed to change human behavior. And the behavior change wheel is one such integrative model. Now, the behavior change wheel has high-level policy impact in the UK, such as this 2019 report from Public Health England on how you can use the behavior change wheel as a guide for national government behavior change. or this guide published, I do believe, last year by Wales on how to improve human health and well-being using behavioral science, using the behavior change wheel. Now, the behavior change wheel has been synthesized from 19 different behavior change models. It's comprehensive and a systematic framework for designing, evaluating, and characterizing behavior change intervention. And it's been largely applied to the health sector, but its application to environmental issues is growing with, for example, this report again from the Welsh government on how we can use behavioral science to respond to the climate crisis, again, using the behavior change wheel. Other examples of how the behavior change wheel has been used for environmental issues, you have some references of how it's been used for pro-environmental behavior. Soga and Gaston used it on how to facilitate nature contact, and then it's being used more recently in biodiversity conservation. So the behavior change wheel itself looks like this. It has 3 layers. The inner hub, the green layer, represents the factors that influence any behavior, so that one's capabilities, opportunities, and motivations. The red circle is the 9 different types of interventions, and the gray circle are 7 different policy options that can help deliver those interventions. So focusing on the core of the behavior change wheel is the COM-B. It's called that because capability, opportunity, and motivation, COM, all interact with one another to influence behavior. So the inner circle, this inner wheel of the behavior change wheel, helps us to identify the factors that act as either barriers or facilitators to engaging in the target behavior. And you understand people's, capabilities, their motivations, and their opportunities for engaging or not engaging in the behavior in order to lead to the development of interventions. Now, these interventions from the behavior change wheel are things such as education, restriction, environmental restructuring, etc. I'll let you see here what the definitions of them are, so I don't have to read them all out to you. But designing an intervention involves systematically considering the full range of intervention options available to change a person or a population's capability, opportunity, or motivational influences that have been identified in the behavioral diagnosis. So, we may find that someone or a population doesn't cycle to work because there are no safe segregated bike lanes, for example, at which point that helps us to look at a behavior change intervention that might say, well, maybe we need to change the physical or social environment or context to put it in bike lanes, for example, the environmental restructuring intervention to facilitate people to use bikes to cycle to work. And then there are these 7 policy options in the green layer that help support the delivery of the intervention. And the behavior change wheel could be used in 4 different ways. Here, I will discuss only option 2, which is applying the behavior change wheel retrospectively to audit current interventions and policies. So retrofit here means identifying what is in current intervention and policies. It's applying the behavior change wheel retrospectively to identify the content. So, what type of interventions of the 9 different intervention types and the 7 different policy options in the behavior change wheel appear in these policy documents or interventions. What types are being used or maybe underused, overused, for example. So it's applying the behavior change wheel retrospectively to audit the content of current policies and interventions. And I'm going to give you 2 examples of how I have done that recently as an academic. So the first is the result of a study published in Conservation Biology in 2020 with myself and other colleagues from IDIV, the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, and the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. And we specifically looked at pollinator conservation initiatives. And this is because insects and pollinators are declining all over the world. And the loss of these pollinators threatens human health and well-being. We're dependent on pollinators to pollinate the food that we eat. And so while there's been high-level policies to help support pollinators and stop their decline, it's not really clear whether and how these policies to support pollinators consider behavior change at all. And so we answer that question by retrofitting the behavior change wheel to these policies to provide some insight. So we conducted this analysis on 8 national policy initiatives in Europe. As of March 2019, there were only 8 national pollinator initiatives in the EU area. And these are from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, England, Scotland, all of Ireland, Wales, and the EU. And we only analyzed the action plans of each of these policies. Now, these policies will usually have a lot of text where they talk about, why they're being developed, but then at the end they'll say, this is what France is going to do to conserve pollinators. This is what Wales is going to do to conserve pollinators. And we analyze that bit. And here's an example. So using directed content analysis, which is a qualitative analysis method, we applied the categories from the theory of the behavior change wheel to these policy actions. So using an example from DEFRA's English National Pollinator Strategy, the action 1 here is develop and test a new systematic and sustainable monitoring framework for pollinators to be implemented by professionals and by using a citizen science approach. So here, the provision of a pollinator monitoring scheme is an example of enablement, in that it has the potential to increase capacity beyond training or education. And the behavior change wheel policy category or policy option that it best fits is service provision. And that's because developing a citizen science pollinator scheme is providing a service or delivering a service. So we did that procedure for all of the all of the action plans in these 8 EU policy documents. And so there were 610 conservation actions in the 8 policy documents. As a lot of actions may have mentioned more than one intervention type or policy option, this led us to have over 700 intervention function codes and policy category codes. And this is the result of our analysis. The first thing we found was that the full range of intervention types available to conserve pollinators was not being used in these documents. The most frequently coded human behavior change intervention was education, which is to increase one's knowledge or understanding. However, we know from the psychological literature and the behavioral sciences literature that education on its own isn't really an effective intervention for pro-environmental behavior. And to be more effective, in education as an intervention needs to be combined with other types of interventions. In contrast, we found that the behavior change intervention of coercion, which is increasing the anticipation of a cost or a punishment, such as having a fine for engaging in a certain behavior, was not coded in any of the 8 pollinator policy documents. We also found that other least frequently used or coded interventions were things like modeling, which is being an example of good practice, being a role model. That was only mentioned in 4% of the actions. Incentivization, so providing an award or subsidy to encourage behavior was mentioned in only 3% of the policy actions, and restriction such as banning pesticides was only mentioned in only like 2% of the actions. And these underused interventions have been shown in the behavioral sciences literature to be really effective at changing behavior, and yet they are underused when looking at these policy documents to conserve pollinators. The other thing that I want to mention here is just that in about 20% of the interventions and policy options, we were unable to identify any intervention or policy. They were unclassifiable, which means that either the action was too vague and it just said maybe there needs to be more conservation of bees, for example. And you're like, well, how do we do that? There was no intervention or policy that was mentioned, or that the policy action, the conservation action was about research. So there needs to be more research on the impact of foreign bees on native bees, for example, which research in it of itself is not a behavior change intervention. So the next thing that we did for all of the 610 conservation actions identified in these 8 policy documents was to look at who was the target group. So whose behavior needed to change, and also who was the agent of change in these actions. So we found that in 40% of the 610 actions, 40% did not specify a target group. So they failed to mention the target of the intervention. So whose behavior needs to be changed here? Who needs to change their behavior to conserve pollinators? Just not mentioned. And research from the behavioral sciences tells us that in order for behavior change interventions to be effective, we need to identify who needs to change their behavior. So the fact that 41% of all actions to conserve pollinators in these policy documents didn't specify this impairs the success of the policy documents, of these interventions. When looking at the other, when specified the other targets, the target groups were largely at the level of the individual. And so that tells us that there's less focus on systemic behavioral, transformative behavioral changes. And we know from research that there can be larger gains for nature conservation when interventions are at the level above the individual, so at the level of the community, business, or government level. And we're not really seeing that in the policy documents for pollinators. Yes, so the main target group are individuals. And now when looking at the agent of change, so who's responsible for implementing these actions to conserve pollinators? Seeing as most of them came from governments, it's not really surprising that government agencies were largely identified as the agent of change that was going to enact the policy document. So it's, DEFRA, it's going to be the Ministry of Transport, that sort of thing. So that was for only a specific aspect of biodiversity conservation with regards to pollinators. And so next I did work sort of replicating this, looking at national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And this is work I did with colleagues from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Germany and UCL as part of the IPBES values assessment. Now, the reason that we focused on MBSABs was that global biodiversity targets, the Aichi targets, they continue to fail. They have failed. And why do they fail? This is a question for nature conservation, is why do these global biodiversity targets continue to fail? Could it be that these policies are written in such a way that fail to trigger behavioral change? And so we decided to answer that question by retrospectively applying the behavior change wheel to national biodiversity strategy action plans. The goal of NBSABs is to mainstream biodiversity into national policy. It's a requirement if you're a member of the Convention of Biological Diversity, or the CBD. And so these are the country's main policy for biodiversity conservation. And so we wanted to retrospectively apply the behavior change wheel to these policies to see how well behavior change is in these policy documents. And so we looked at 10 NBSABs, 2 from each of the 5 EU regions. And you can see there the countries that we looked at and how well biodiversity is mainstreamed in that country. From these 10 National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plans, or NBSABs, we looked at only the policy actions again. There were 1,306 policy actions in these NBSABs, and analyzing them retrospectively, doing the same thing, directed content analysis, we found that 22% of all of the actions identified a target group. Again, only 22% of the 1,306 policy actions identified a target group. Again, highlighting this lack of specificity might undermine the success of any actions to change behavior. On the contrary, we found that 75% of all of the actions were able to identify the agent of change. So who was going to be responsible for delivering that action? Again, being national government documents, the agent of change was largely government ministries, Ministry of Transport, for example. Intervention types were mentioned in about 48% of the policy actions. So less than half of the actions actually were specific enough to mention a policy type. On the contrary, 83%, almost double of the policy actions, clearly identified a policy option. Now, keep in mind that in the behavior change wheel, these policy options, the gray circle only exists to help support the delivery of the interventions. So this suggests that the NBSABs clearly identify the agent of change responsible for enacting a policy action, and they identify the policy to support a behavior change intervention, but are less clear about the target group whose behavior needs to be changed and the intervention to use to achieve that behavioral change. This diagram shows you of the 9 intervention types in the behavior change wheel, the frequency with which that they were mentioned in the 1,306 policy actions. The first thing, in contrary to looking at the pollinator policies, the full range of interventions from the behavior change wheel were used here. Looking at the NBSABs, the most frequent intervention types were enablement and environmental restructuring and education. And the least frequently coded intervention types were coercion, modeling, and incentivization, or here it's called rewarding. These findings are similar to the pollinator policies, where we also found that education and environmental restructuring were the most frequently used intervention types, and that coercion didn't show up at all, and modeling and incentivization were used very infrequently. So in conclusion, to enable transformative change, there needs to be effective human behavior change in support of nature conservation. But often the behavioral sciences are not applied in policy or practice in the area or field of nature conservation and biodiversity conservation. As such, looking at both pollinator policies and national biodiversity strategy and action plans, these policy documents are not behaviorally specific. They often fail to identify whose behavior needs to change, so the target group. And they also overuse some of the interventions. such as education, enablement, environmental restructuring, and they underuse or overlook other interventions that from the behavioral sciences have been shown to be more effective, such as social modeling or coercion. And so thank you very much for your time. And I'm happy to answer any questions. You can reach me on my email here or via Twitter. All right, thank you very much.